Welcome everyone to this Monday edition of Inside India. I'm Sri Jegarajah. Here are your headlines. Oil prices are staying elevated in Asian trade as the Iran-Israel conflict continues to fuel supply disruption fears. And this comes as Iran claims a new wave of missile strikes on Israel, with reports saying residential buildings were struck in Tel Aviv. Fresh data out of China painting a mixed picture for the world's second largest economy. Retail sales growing faster than analysts' estimates. Industrial output, though, missing expectations, while the beleaguered housing sector continued to see a slowdown in prices. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is set to meet the leader of Cyprus today to strengthen business ties. He's expected to head to Canada next to meet with leaders on the sidelines of the G7 summit. Right, so the big macro risk for global markets is really coming from the oil end of the spectrum, and especially as this unfolding geopolitical situation continues in the Middle East, as insofar as the Israel strikes on Iran and Iran's retaliation is concerned, and it really comes down to energy infrastructure in the region that's going to drive risk sentiment. Indian markets join us in about 45 minutes' time. This is what GIFT Nifty futures are indicating. 24,804. So we are, in fact, looking at an incline of about 100 points or so. Dollar-rupee exchange rate at 86.1430. Let's take a look at the broader Asian markets, because, as I said, for now, these dramatic and disturbing developments in the Middle East involving our direct conflict now between Israel and Iran, the markets, some of them are taking them in their stride. The global oil market seems to have reflected the peak anxiety, perhaps, in that $10 a barrel plus move on Friday. The concern now, as I said, is whether energy infrastructure stands to get affected in the region, not least of all the Strait of Hormuz. If it is closed or blocked, some analysts say expect a spike to $120 a barrel in short order. We're also keeping tabs on oil, of course, after that 10% jump on Friday, continuing to climb today. This is where we are standing for light crude and Brent. Around the mid-70s, so perhaps $80 a barrel is the high watermark in terms of the peak anxiety insofar as the risk premium is concerned. But this is still a very fluid, developing story. And as I said, it really does depend on the duration of this conflict and whether energy infrastructure is affected. Now, the conflict between Iran and Israel escalating as both sides continued missile strikes over the weekend, killing and wounding civilians. In the last hour, the Israeli military says missiles have been launched from Iran towards Israel. CNBC's Dan Murphy has the latest from Washington, D.C.
Israel has intensified its military campaign inside Iranian territory, striking oil depots, missile launchers and facilities tied to Iran's nuclear and defense infrastructure. So far, Israel has not directly targeted Iran's oil export terminals, but energy markets remain on high alert, with traders now bracing for a potential retaliation and wider regional fallout. Over the weekend, Iran launched a wave of drones and missiles at Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and Haifa. Air raid sirens sent residents into bomb shelters, and at least 13 people were killed. More than 370 were injured, according to Israeli officials. Now, a U.S. official tells NBC News President Trump rejected a proposal from Israel to assassinate Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. When asked by Fox News if regime change is Israel's objective, Prime Minister Netanyahu did not deny the report, saying only we'll do what we need to do. If confirmed, the proposal reveals just how far Israel may have been willing to go and the level of coordination or tension with Washington behind the scenes. Politically, the fallout continues. President Trump has publicly distanced the U.S. from Israel's military operations, insisting Washington had nothing to do with the strikes. But he also issued a stark warning, saying if Iran targets U.S. assets, he will respond with the full force of the American military. The region is on edge and watching the path of escalation closely. In Washington, D.C., Dan Murphy, CNBC.
Dan, thank you for that. In the meantime, it was a mixed bag of data out of China this morning. Let's make sense of what it meant with Elaine Yu in Hong Kong. Elaine, on balance, does this square with a deflationary environment still in China? And does that imply that the PBOC still have some work to do?
Hi, Sri. It is a mixed bag indeed. And there is some unexpected data coming out. China's consumption surprisingly improved as China and the U.S. reached a trade truce last month. So retail sales in May rose 6.4% from a year earlier. That's far exceeding analysts' expectations of 5%, according to estimates by a Reuters poll. That might have been helped by the June 18 shopping festival that started earlier this year in mid-May, and home appliances notably soared 53%, and that is the result of subsidies that has really helped consumer goods and clearly designed to boost domestic demand. So the question is, how long this uptick in consumer spending can last, as these shopping festivals and subsidies have certainly helped, and perhaps as a one-off or a short-term measure. So in terms of how much Beijing wants to support domestic demand, we'll have to see how these sentiments last. And with falling home prices that we're seeing, that's still evidence of downbeat sentiments. Industrial output, on the other hand, slightly missed estimates in May, growing 5.8% compared to estimates of 5.9%. So it shows that China's exports is being dragged down by the tariff uncertainties, with exports to the U.S. plunging almost 35%. Last month, but exports to EU and ASEAN still seeing double-digit growth. So industrial production is still leading. Consumption is surprisingly leading industrial production, and that should give policymakers some relief as it navigates these trade talks with the U.S. Sri.
Elaine, thank you. And it still remains that Beijing is very committed to underwriting 5% GDP and they have the capacity to do so. Thank you for that, Elaine. Right, let's bring in Dave Ernsberger now, co-president at S&P Global Commodity Insights. He joins us from the sidelines of the Energy Asia 2025 conference in Kuala Lumpur. Dave, great to have you on the programme. And you and I have seen our fair share of volatility cycles in the oil market. How well prepared then are Japan, India, China, South Korea, the major net importers in this region, from an emergency stockpiles point of view?
Well, hi, Sri. It's a pleasure to be with you all from here in Kuala Lumpur. And it's a very important question that you asked there, because you were talking in some of the opening commentary here about peak concern and peak risk. Actually, my personal opinion is that we are nowhere near peak risk at this point. And the reason is because of the preparedness of those major importing nations that you're talking about. Actually, the global oil markets have entered June with relatively low stockpiles of raw materials, especially relatively low stockpiles of crude oil. Not the lowest we've ever seen, but relatively low. So the market can handle a regional conflict, even one as serious as Israel and Iran right now. But that is determinedly being kept as a regional conflict. If there's an escalation there in that contest that's going on, let's say there is an attack on another military, the U.S. military or others, or if there's a shutdown of the Straits of Hormuz, the major importing economies of North Asia and even Southeast Asia are not really well prepared for that, primarily because of low inventory.
Interesting, Dave. I thought it was the other way around. The supply side, my understanding was that this was not a tight market by any standards. In fact, isn't there a global surplus in the realm of in excess of 1.5 million barrels a day? And isn't that enough to potentially offset any supply disruption from the Middle East, should it materialize?
It's a fascinating debate, and your comment there speaks very clearly to why we have low inventories. So You are absolutely right that all things being equal, supply increases in 2025 are greater than demand increases in 2025. So supply is running ahead of demand in terms of growth. That's absolutely correct. But as a result, industry participants have become more comfortable with living what I would call hand to mouth. They're maintaining relatively low stockpiles, and that means if all things are not equal, if there is a disruption to supply, the market isn't prepared for that. So all things being equal, we have more than we can handle. But in the event of a supply concern, a major shutoff of supply, we're not really ready. Let me give you one statistic to remind everybody. 20% of the world's LNG flows past the Strait of Hormuz, and 30% of the world's crude oil. Now, imagine what it would do to the markets if we lost that capacity. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's got to be at the back of people's minds.
Absolutely. And we saw how Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in 22 sparked a global energy crisis and an unassociated global inflation shock. Does this unfolding, and it is still very early days here, Israel-Iran conflict risk doing the same, Dave?
Well, you know, to give you a bit of perspective on that, when the war began in Ukraine, the world was reacting to the loss of about between 6 and 8 million barrels a day of Russian oil supply and a certain amount of gas supply into Europe. If this conflict between Israel and Iran escalates to a point where the Strait of Hormuz shuts down, we're going to lose between 15 and 18 million barrels a day of oil supply. So more than twice as much will come off the market. Of course, the price of oil spiked to $135 a barrel when the war broke out in Ukraine. We could see a much higher price than that if this conflict gets even further out of control in the Middle East. So you can see how hard everybody's working to keep this conflict contained within the region for that very reason.
Yes, and add to the tariff-led uncertainty in the global slowdown, and you potentially could have a stagflation scenario on your hands. We've already seen how Iranian airstrikes and Iranian retaliation has targeted Haifa and damaged oil refinery there. How vulnerable is energy infrastructure in the broader region, in the broader GCC, from the Strait of Hormuz that you alluded to earlier, to Saudi Aramco's oil refineries and oil fields? And the memory of the Abqaiq Khurais attack is still very fresh in the collective minds.
Yeah. The memory of the Abqaiq attack, which must be around 10 years ago now, is something people still talk about to me in these markets, Sri. And that's before this latest conflict broke out, which is a way of saying that actually infrastructure is widely spread out, is relatively difficult to defend, and I'm going to guess gets less priority than defending, rightly, by the way, centers of population and civilian mass areas. So it's difficult to defend oil infrastructure. There's no doubt about it. And it's relatively straightforward to attack. Everybody knows where it is. It doesn't move, obviously, and it's susceptible. So those attacks on tank farms, pipelines, refineries, and more is front of people's minds right now.
The Strait of Hormuz and Karg Island are absolutely critical for Iran, if anything else. If they were blocked, right, or if they were closed, then $120 a barrel, possibly north of that, that's not improbable.
North of $130 a barrel is probable if the Strait of Hormuz is closed.
Yes.
The people I talk to, including here in Kuala Lumpur, are under the impression that Iran will not close the Strait of Hormuz because it, of course, affects its own exports of oil, but even more importantly, it affects its relationship across the Middle East, and it doesn't want to lose the support of people it feels like it has on its side today.
What about OPEC? OPEC Plus production policy and its drive to defend market share. That's built a sizable buffer, hasn't it, in global inventories. Do they have ample spare capacity to draw on if needed to do more?
Yeah, so OPEC has plenty of spare capacity to bring back to market, particularly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, to some degree Kuwait. definitely upwards of 2 to 3 million barrels a day of supply capacity that could be restored to market in relatively short order if the market needed it. Now, of course, the challenge here is if we were to lose a significant amount of Iranian production, that's kind of counterbalanced by losing Iranian production if there are continued attacks on Iranian oil infrastructure. So 2 or 3 million barrels a day might sound like quite a bit, and it is quite a bit. But if you lose a lot of Iranian on the other side, that's a like-for-like loss at that point. So net-net, we could come out only slightly ahead if OPEC released really all of its supply capacity that it has in its back pocket.
Dave, let's bring in India's policy now, India's energy policy, and let's start with the crude oil diversification strategy. Is that working, or is it problematic in an environment where India doesn't really seem to have a problem importing crude from Russia, Venezuela? It's unclear as to whether it's still importing Iranian crude. Maybe you can settle a score there. And New Delhi insists that it is acting within international norms and conventions.
Yeah, I certainly don't know at the moment if India continues to import Iranian crude. There are many ways to import Iranian crude all around the world. A lot of it won't be labeled Iranian by the time it arrives in your country, hence a lot of the confusion out there. But I will say that the diversification strategy overall has been a wild success for India. India, from Narendra Modi throughout the administration, has made it very clear that it has a national imperative to bring in the most affordable energy supplies, beyond crude oil, by the way, to make sure India's economy is supported by the cheapest available possible energy forms. Using that last dip in prices that we saw between March and end of May, India did succeed in bringing in more supplies, notably from Argentina most recently. And that whole diversification strategy is just making sure that Indian importers are able to bring in crude from whoever the most competitive supplier is, be it Russian, be it American, be it Argentinian. So in that regard, I would say they've been successful. India is playing a very canny game to try and make sure it has available to it the cheapest possible supplier of oil or natural gas.
Yes, and it was interesting that Prime Minister Modi a couple of months ago was in Saudi Arabia to really consolidate that energy relationship and cooperation. And speaking of which, Amin Nasser, Saudi Aramco's CEO, speaking in KL, history has shown that when conflicts occur, he says, the importance of oil and gas can't be understated. And Amin Nasser going on to say, we are witnessing threats to energy security in real time. Given that backdrop, Dave, how close or how far away is India to energy independence?
Well, one of the things that we track very carefully is the work that goes on in India around developing a national framework for domestic energy supplies. And a lot of that will boil down to the successful industrialization of renewable energy, solar power, hydropower, and wind power. And that is, despite strong government backing and strong private sector backing, it's a long journey with lots of peaks and troughs along the way. So the only way India will get energy independence truly is by building out domestically supplied renewable energy sources and, of course, expanding local oil and gas production, which is underway. India will always import more oil and gas than it produces, at least for the next 20 years. So that renewable energy push is critical. And there are some tricky moments going on right now with finding supply chain resilience and off-takers for renewable power. That is a barrier right now. Because remember, the Indian economy is especially a cost-sensitive economy.
That's such a great point, Dave. And Germany's pro-renewables energy policy and the banning of nuclear power illustrated how all forms of energy need to be part of this transition. So this is the dilemma that global policymakers are facing. For India, how are they balancing the low-carbon future with supply security and affordability?
Right. So India is constantly moving fairly nimbly between oil and gas, renewable energy, and we must call out coal as well as an important part of building out its national energy resilience. Now, coal is about affordability. Oil and gas is about immediate economics, and renewable power really is about trying to decarbonize the economy and promote national energy security. it's tricky to get all those three things going at the same time.
Let's bring in the upstream side of the equation. You've done a lot of work on this. Exploration activity is dwindling globally. It seems like all the low-hanging fruit has been taken, and prospectivity is getting increasingly challenging. Does India present an opportunity for the international oil companies, and how does that square with the national oil companies' domestic priority to build national energy security?
Yeah. Well, India has done a lot of great work in the last 6 years from an exploration and production perspective anyways, on streamlining and making more market-oriented its upstream E&P sector. So at India Energy Week just a couple of months ago in Delhi, you could feel the renewed interest and money being spent on revisiting the actually relatively rich sources of prospective oil and gas within India. And there's a guaranteed market for that when it comes to market. So the work that India has done around streamlining policy and making the actual sellable prices more market-oriented have spurred the interest in developing oil and gas within India. The challenge there, of course, is that Indian oil and gas reserves are relatively small compared to both what it needs and what the global energy market could offer alternatively. But India has made great progress in building up interest in investing in its own sector.
Dave, and how do you feel about India's EV policy and its transition towards a low-carbon future? Most visibly, this is illustrated by Prime Minister Modi's 30% EV penetration by 2030. Is it having any structural impact on displacing gasoline?
It's, of course, all of these initiatives are going to slow the rate of demand growth for gasoline. And actually, we've seen the growth in oil demand, including gasoline and diesel in India, being relatively small in the first half of 2025, partly owing to topics like this and partly owing to the generally slightly slower overall economic environment. But, of course, India faces some challenges with EV penetration and EV deployment that are closer to the U.S. experience than the Chinese experience. And what I'm talking about, there is a lack of natural availability of critical minerals and the relative expense of putting in place the infrastructure required to support a large EV fleet. So India is better positioned than the U.S. because it has a closer proximity to potentially affordable sources of EVs, but it has a bit of a shortfall of natural ability to install that industry. So it's going to be a higher mountain to climb with fewer apparatus to get there.
Dave, what about nuclear? How important is that in terms of the broader transition? And could it be part of a US-India trade deal? We know that LNG, we know that defence is going to be two major cornerstones. Could nuclear be the same?
Yeah, nuclear is a really exciting one. Here at Energy Asia this morning, we were hearing from the Prime Minister of Malaysia that that 5.2 billion people will live in Asia Pacific by 2050, which is, of course, 25 years from now. But more than half the world's population will be here, and at least half of the world's energy demand will also be in Asia Pacific. Now, that creates a wonderful opportunity, economically speaking and scientifically speaking, to start to work on new, more agile forms of nuclear power. And in India especially, there's tremendous potential for innovative nuclear technologies such as small modular reactors. We hear a lot of talk about that. One of the emphasis points at this conference and also at events in India is taking policy and turning it into practice. India is a perfect environment, especially with the US-India agreement, to invest in and develop modular nuclear technology that would deliver a lot of energy into that mix.
Dave, we'll wrap it up there. Always great catching up with you, especially at such a volatile period in energy markets. Dave Ernsberger there from S&P Global Commodity Insights. We're back in 2 minutes. Welcome back. Nippon Steel gets the all clear for its purchase of US Steel. Lin Lin's got the details. And Lin, this is good news. Good optics, good momentum heading into Ishiba and Trump's meeting at the G7.
Absolutely. The timing here is so critical because this deal has really been hanging over relations between US and Japan for some time now. It was 18 months ago that we first found out that Nippon was looking to buy US Steel. And really what has seemed to change the calculus now is the fact that the US President Donald Trump has required that the two companies sign a national security agreement to deal with the risks on that front, and that includes that Nippon will be investing $11 billion over the next couple of years into US Steel, and also that the US government will be given a golden share. Now, we don't have the details of that. The agreement has not been revealed to the public, but based on the conversations that we've had with US senators for that matter, they've basically said this is a veto right that the US government will have in terms of key management decisions.
And a step in the right direction towards a US-Japan trade deal, quite possibly, and the Trump administration needs a win. Lin, excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. We will continue to track the Indian markets after this short break. Welcome back. One of the biggest events of the aviation industry, the Paris Air Show, opens today, but it's expected to be quite a sombre affair as the shadow of last week's Air India crash in Ahmedabad looms large. The Boeing CEO is skipping the Paris Air Show, but in the meantime, the Indian government says it is investigating all of Boeing's 787 commercial jets used in the country.
We do have a very strict protocol, robust protocol, which we follow every time. But even after, when the incident happened, we also felt that there is a need to do an extended surveillance into the Boeing 787 series. So from the DGCA, we have also given an order to do the extended surveillance for the 787 planes. There are 34 in our Indian aircraft fleet today. I believe that 8 have already been inspected, and then with immediate urgency, all of them are going to be done.
Air India too is investigating all of its 787 fleet. The fatal crash took the lives of all but one of the 242 people on board. The airline has also announced an interim compensation of around $29,000 for the victims.
Financial support. Air India will be making an interim payment of 25 lakh rupees, or approximately 21,000 British pounds, to each of the families of the deceased and also to the survivor. This is in addition to the 1 crore rupees, or approximately 85,000 British pounds, already committed by Tata Sons. Air India is also in the process of completing precautionary safety checks on Boeing 787 aircraft, as directed by our regulator, the DGCA. We will complete all checks within the timelines prescribed by the regulator. As has been confirmed by the authorities, the aircraft's data recorder has been recovered, which will form part of the official investigation. And Air India continues to fully cooperate with these investigations.
Both the black boxes have been recovered from the crash site and are expected to help the investigation. In the meantime, rescue and recovery efforts continue on the ground. CNBC TV18's Madhya Mujua filed this report from Ahmedabad.
We are reporting from the civil hospital in Ahmedabad, where hundreds of family members of the victims of the plane crash have gathered to collect the mortal remains of their loved ones. Authorities are releasing bodies as and when the DNA samples match, but the process of handing over bodies is very long and complicated. First, the family member who gave the DNA sample is called inside with a proper ID card for verification. Authorities are asking that family member to sign on a document. Families are shown the sealed coffin. They have been advised to not open the coffin because the bodies had suffered severe burns due to the explosion. Authorities are also providing these families with an ambulance and an escort vehicle. The escort vehicle has a medical officer, a police officer and a professional counselor who are making sure that this entire process is less painful for these grieving families. Meanwhile, investigations continue on the crash site. A team of Boeing officials visited the crash site. They spent 2 hours looking at multiple angles, looking at the wreckage of the plane, and trying to understand what could have led to the crash. Investigators also continue to look into the black box. They're going through the cockpit voice recordings and the flight data recordings to understand the reasons, the possible reasons that could have led to the crash of the 787 Dreamliner. For now, for these grieving families, they're holding on to unanswered questions and painful memories. The agony and the wait to bid a final goodbye to their loved ones is only getting longer. In Ahmedabad, with video journalist Prashant Guge, this is Madhya Mujawar for CNBC Asia.
And our thoughts are with those families. In other news, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is heading to the G7 summit under the invitation of G7 host Canada. This will be Prime Minister Modi's first visit to the country in over a decade and comes amid New Delhi and Toronto's history of tensions. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said there are important discussions that India, as a major economic force, needs to be a part of. Ahead of the trip to Canada, Prime Minister Modi has a 2-day stop in Cyprus to meet with its president and business leaders. India is pursuing a trade corridor with the EU and the Middle East, and this visit focuses on advancing that project. Let's bring it back to the markets. We are counting down to the market open in India, despite the risks emanating from the Middle East and the transmission mechanism, of course, through the oil price. This is how we are shaping up in terms of the open. We're looking at Gift Nifty futures, predicting 24,810. So trying to get back to that elusive 25K level. That was taken out last week. Nifty 50 on Friday closed below 25K at 24,718. So we're looking about 100 points off an incline or so. Dollar rupee exchange rate at 86.1810. Quick look at some of the risk assets, and this is how we are shaping up for Brent and WTI. The global indicators are up, but not as much as they were on Friday. Dollar index at 98.32, and gold, of course, a big beneficiary of a flight to safety, $3,434, and a similar story with US Treasuries. and the benchmark 10-year yielding 4.4264. Right, what does all this mean for Indian assets? Let's bring in Anand Gupta now, lead portfolio manager at Alliance Global Investors. He joins me here at the SGX. Anand, welcome. How will markets price in this new external risks coming from the Middle East and through the oil price?
Thanks for having me on the show, Sri. Markets, we have seen now, are more anchored to longer-term earnings. We just had a geopolitical event of India-Pakistan. Yes. Market hardly corrected, less than 5%, and then it quickly recovered. And we have seen in Russia-Ukraine, which happened a few years ago. Somehow, equity is always anchored to longer-term earnings, and India continues to stay fastest-growing economy, fastest-growing bottom-up estimates, and we are seeing positive surprises coming out of recent interest rate cuts and GDP coming better than expectation. So in an environment like that, where you are having a positive surprise, you are the fastest growing economy, beyond few days of volatility, it's unlikely to impact. And if I may add one or two more thoughts, oil as percentage of India GDP has been coming down. Services exports, IT services have been going up. Unlike 20 years ago, we now have more export revenue from services than what we pay for oil imports. So the resilience of India is much more than what it used to be, what many, old hands think about.
So, in other words, another way of thinking of it, Anand, is that India is less exposed to volatility in international oil markets. But you would imagine that if this situation does drag on, and if it does affect oil infrastructure, at what price point is this going to be a problem in terms of inflation coming back for India? Are we talking about $90, $95, $100 a barrel?
So forward curves are still pointing to a lower oil.
Yes.
Not just 1 year down the line, 2 years down the line, even 1 quarter down the line. So even oil markets are not pricing in a rally in oil. That's first point. Second, it's underappreciated. Indian oil is priced at $75, not at the $60 which it was. So the base for Indian oil, which consumer is paying at a retail pump or in every other form, is much higher because the product prices have been kept at $75. And elasticity of economy is 30 bips to every $10 oil price hike. But that starts impacting you negatively once you start going beyond $100. And that doesn't seem to be the forecast as of now. So I would say India has seen $100, $120 oil not many years ago, in fact in 2014, then before that in 2011. So this level of oil is very much manageable, given that services exports are more, it doesn't have any macroeconomic, it has good forex reserves, much better current account deficit. So India now is very different from what it used to be of 2011 or 2003.
How did the recent surprise 50-pointer by the RBI change the narrative in the equities market?
This shows you policymakers are now pro-growth. What happened from last March 2024 to September 24, Indian policymakers became cautious and they wanted to curb excessive risk-taking, and they tried to lower the credit growth. It went from 16 to 10%. Our own reading is now they want to take it back to 13%, and a 50 bit front loaded with CRR cuts will certainly incentivize. And Sri, if I can give you an example, mortgage rates are already going towards 7%. I'm brought up in Bombay. I wanted to buy a house and 7% was a very good rate. So once you see these repo rates going to a 25-year low, X of GFC, X of COVID, it will certainly incentivize, it will accelerate more demand. So there'll be a good transmission, and it will lead to our earnings upgrades in financials, in consumer discretionary by the festival season of Diwali.
So this was squarely aimed at raising demand for credit and credit velocity in the system. Is that because the RBI saw problems on the horizon? They saw household debt mounting and they wanted to get ahead of the curve?
two things. Once the rate cut is a natural outcome on inflation. We are seeing inflation easing out after COVID. Inflation is always a tax on poor. So the rural India never recovered after COVID till 3 months ago. Now, if we look at tractor sales, rural India is recovering. Right. Inflation has eased. Core inflation has nosedived. So interest rate are outcome of that. That's one. Second, yes, last year, government got worried when unsecured loans were growing at 30% CAGR, and they were worried some of those could be going into equity market, and they did a lot of things which is right to do for the longevity of India, for resilience of India, rather than just growing at an accelerated pace and then nosediving. So yes, there was a risk management measures. They increased the risk weights. They nudged the banks not to grow above 20% on some of the riskier segments. We've seen that all play out, the playbook from March 24 to December 24, and starting Feb, we have seen first the income tax rate cut in the budget, then we have seen RBI risk weights being taken down, and then we have now seen interest rate being cut.
You mentioned the urban versus rural demand profile, and there's something of a split picture there. So how do you factor in how we approach retail and the consumption story within the lens, through the lens of the equities market? Where do you want to be?
India is changing. Millennials and the younger generation, their consumption habits are changing. On one side, demand pattern, wallet share, consumption modes are changing. That's one. Second, supply side, there are stocks which have emerged as disruptor in every category. It could be BPC, it could be travel, and they have gained significant competitive edge, very high market share. So you have to marry these two, what the young consumer wants, where is the wallet share shifting, and which are the models which have a good competitive edge, and you try to get them at a right margin of safety. That's the trinity which every portfolio manager tries to get right, especially us. In consumption, we are seeing across-board opportunities, not just rural, not just urban, because of these digitization-led disruption which is happening.
Is e-commerce, is quick commerce the next big thing? Is that going to be truly transformative, or is that a fad?
It is a transformative because the whole behavior has changed. Inventory pattern has changed. A house lady which used to buy grocery for a month, many of them are now ordering every day. So their inventory pattern is changing. It is leading to a big change in the behavior, which is what I was alluding to. So yes, it will continue to gain very high market shares. So today it is less than 5% of overall market. First they have to gain share from e-commerce, then from general trade. So next 3-5 year runway is very strong for them to gain market share, all the quick commerce players.
How compelling is the valuation opportunity in India? And allied to that, foreign investors, how do they feel about India, and are they more inclined to favour India than China, given the tariff, this very wide tariff differential, and given the fact that India seems to be closing in on a trade deal with the US?
Yeah, so first, foreign investors are now incrementally evaluating India more and more.
Yes.
India has gained size. It's more than $4 trillion market cap.
Yes.
Every large sector is more than 400 billion. If I have to give you an example, MSCI India has 2 times the number of stocks what it had 10 years ago. So it is getting diversified, and the newer business models are attracting a lot of interest. That's first point. Second, Trump 1 was the advantage for India. India had EMS, the biggest smartphone manufacturer in the world, had zero phones being sourced from India. Before Trump presidency 2, it became 15%. And now they've said for all US production, they want to source from India. So that gives you one example how supply chain is moving towards India and is helping India gain market share. Third, versus China, it's always not India or China, it is India and China. And I'll tell you the reason for that. 2/3 of every country assets are from emerging market funds. And on flows, when they get inflow redemption, they end up buying both India and China. It is not A versus B. I'm keeping hedge funds out. So it is contrary to common perception. Longer term trend of India-China flows are positively correlated, not negatively correlated. So I will say both markets offer stock picking opportunities.
Do you think that we will see? I know it's going to be done in stages, and perhaps a provisional interim deal at the end of this month and a conclusive deal by Diwali in mid to late October. If and when that happens, can we expect a private capex and FDI boom into India, or is there going to be a sentiment impact to begin with on the market? And how is this going to be digested by the market?
First, India net goods exports to US are less than 2% of GDP. So it has less to, suffer, get damaged even if the trade deal doesn't happen.
Yes.
Second, both sides are saying they're very advanced stage of closing a trade deal. Yes. Timing is anyone's guess. We hear from our channel checks, of agriculture, all other areas are taken care of, yes, are soft agreements. And it remains to be seen when they pull the plug on that element also. Third, on FDI, if you look at gross FDI trend in India, relative to the world, where the whole world moved more towards US and emerging markets had drawdown, India has been much better. For example, GCCs, there are 1,700 GCCs in India, Global Capability Centers. It is happening right in middle of Trump trade war 2. Every day we hear a new GCC being opened. So yes, longer term tailwind of demographics, less leverage will continue to attract FDI and FI, whether trade deal or no trade deal, though I think trade deal will happen sooner, not later, in terms of the construct of it.
How do you feel about the listed defence space? Because this is an area, it goes hand in hand with small caps, which has generated a lot of interest amongst investors, not least of all because of the India-Pakistan developments. But it clearly seems to be part of the Make in India campaign, the indigenization of the defence industry and possibly increasing the export potential. Is this a good space to own? Or is it looking overvalued?
So we are GARP investor, growth at reasonable price, and we don't find reasonable price in that space because it's quite in fad. And yes, it has longevity of long-term growth. Yes, it will gain market share, but we find better opportunities in other sectors than defense as of now, just because of valuation. And Sri, on your valuation point, which you asked earlier, I wanted to touch upon, India offers you a higher return on equity, highest in all emerging markets. India offers you longest growth runway because of demographics, where everyone else is having negative working age population growth, India is having positive working age population growth. When you put these things in construct, the optically high PE might not look that high as at the first glance. And second point, versus US, the real and nominal rates today are at the lowest of last 25 years. And the valuations of India are 2 standard deviation lower versus US. So something has to balance. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, India looks optically high, but that is because of higher ROE, higher longevity. If you remove those, it will look, those stocks which give you higher growth, higher ROE, it will look cheap. Second, I was trying to offer a thought that in spite of inflation differential, interest rate differential being the lowest of last 25 years, India equity valuations are 2 standard deviation low versus MSCI All Country World Index, which is very interesting.
Anand, final question. I know that we have to be selective, but when you think of the auto companies, pharma and IT services, they seem to be the ones that are most exposed to the externalities, to slower growth conditions and the tariffs. So how selective do we have to be, and how are you approaching those 3 sectors?
We love contrarian opportunities. Yes. Any company which is gaining market share, has a strong competitive edge, is opening new accounts, whether it's IT, information technology, or a CDMO company in pharma, or in auto components, and is being sold, to a 2 standard deviation low of last 10 years, 20 years, is an excellent opportunity. Maybe you can't lose money at that price. You might lose 3 months. So India has become a very diverse pool of stock picking opportunities now.
Very, very finally, where does this put your end-year target for the benchmark Nifty 50?
We think these double-digit earnings growth, more than 6% real GDP growth, will continue to compound. India has delivered more than 10% dollar return last 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year, 30-year. Indian GDP has been more than 5% last 5-year, 10-year, 20-year, 30-year. We think there's enough long runway for this to continue.
We can retake 26,000 by the end of the year?
I think earnings will compound with these positive surprises. I mean, you should just focus on, riding the compounding rather than trying to get XYZ level.
Anand, on that note, we'll leave it there. So thank you very much indeed for joining me. Anand Gupta there from Allianz Global Investors. Right, Indian markets have joined the trading day. We will take a look at some of the early movers and the action in Mumbai after this short break. We are back in 2 minutes. Welcome back. The Indian markets are online, up and running. This is what the benchmark Nifty 50 is doing. It is looking quite constructive, all things considered. And risk factors that we talked about, especially coming from the Middle East. And it's trying to make a run, actually, on 25,000. Not quite getting there. We're up by about a fractional 0.3%. 24,800 is roughly where we stand. Dollar rupee exchange rate, 86.188. Let's give you oil stocks in India, and they are opening up this morning. Supply worries on the back of the Israel-Iran conflict could also pressure Indian oil refiners, but the picture is looking broadly positive. Oil India up by 1.4%, leading the pack. Quick check on the airline stocks who are feeling the pressure from rising oil prices and the fatal Air India crash also weighing on overall sentiment. In the meantime, domestic carrier SpiceJet reporting its highest ever quarterly profit in Q4. Strong yields and cost controls helped drive the airline's bottom line. SpiceJet also turned profitable for the financial year 24-25 for the first time since FY18. And mining giant Vedanta is considering proposing an interim dividend. Its board is set to meet on Wednesday to decide on the proposal. June the 24th has been fixed as the record date for the dividend. Vedanta stock right now up by 0.7%. One final check on the Asian markets, and we are looking at a mixed picture, some resilience. Overall, the Indian market, as we said, in Australia, which is stable at 8,550. Nikkei up by 1%, liking the news, as Lynn has been reporting, on the Nippon Steel getting over the line with US Steel. Kospi up by almost 1%, although the laggards are mainly in Southeast Asia and the Hang Seng. Shanghai Composite, after the mixed data, flat at 3,378. And that's all the time that we have today on Inside India. Do keep watching CNBC. Access Middle East is up next.